I open this public session of the Doctoral Examination Committee of the Faculty of Religion and Theology with the bottom. Our help is in the name of the Lord, who made heaven and earth. Prior to the examination, I invite the candidate to give a brief explanation of the research on which his thesis is based.
Rector, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for the honor of presenting to you today. The story of my dissertation begins on a train. About 10 years ago, I traveled to Atlanta to attend a denominational conference, and I took a train from the airport to the church where the conference was held. On the train, I noticed an incredible diversity of people. I noticed innumerable nationalities, ethnicities, and languages. We arrived at the conference, and the primary focus of this denominational conference was becoming a missional church. Much was made about how our society is changing, and the church must reclaim its identity as a missionary community to the surrounding society. It was very inspiring, but I kept thinking about the train. Looking around the room of about 1,000 people, only a small handful of non-white participants were present. And I felt the irony of the fact that as we called for a renewed mission to the people of the surrounding society, we did not even come close to reflecting the people of that society to whom we believed we were sent. I felt dissonance that the call to missional renewal was not matched by a recognition of our changing multicultural reality. I began to ask, what if we might need to change to become the missional people we believe God is calling us to be? American society is undergoing a remarkable cultural transformation. Just in the last 50 years, nearly 59 million immigrants have arrived in the US. By 2042, whites will be a minority majority in the US, and by 2055, the US will not have a single racial ethnic majority. And yet, despite these dramatic changes, the typical American Protestant congregation remains unchanged. Only 12.5% of Protestant churches in the US qualify as multi-ethnic, and among Presbyterian and Reformed churches, that is even smaller. I believe this represents a crisis of the church's mission. If God really calls the church to be a missionary people, and if our society is rapidly becoming a multicultural society, it is imperative that the church embraces the change that is required to reach its new multicultural context. But this is not just about adopting new styles or programs. It would actually involve a crisis of theology that brings a congregation's own theological identity into question as it discovers the limitations of its own traditions and must think freshly about God and God's work in the world. It's essential that we develop not just new techniques, but new theologies to empower the modern Western church to engage in mission in a post-colonial, super diverse world. The central question of this thesis is this: what theological themes contribute to a missionary ecclesiology that is reformed and also suitable for congregations operating in the context of cultural plurality? Let me unpack that. First, missionary ecclesiology. Ecclesiology just simply means a theology of the church, and missionary ecclesiology affirms that the sentness or the calling of the church to bear witness to Jesus Christ is at the core of its identity. Reformed. I chose to focus on churches and theologies in the Reformed tradition, first of all, because it's my own tradition and I know it best, but also because I wanted to work with a tradition that deeply values its Western European theological heritage, but also has uniquely struggled to reach diverse populations. And yet I also wanted this ecclesiology to be suitable in a way that was recognizably Reformed without abandoning Catholicity, that was able to be applicable and useful to churches and other traditions and contexts. So at root, this study is an examination of missiological and theological appropriation and contextualization, how congregations of the West can wrestle with the tension between their own theological heritage and the new multicultural environment of mission. So let me briefly just outline my approach. In the first chapter, I assessed the challenge that examine the challenges facing Reformed congregations as they attempt to adapt missiologically to diverse contexts. I did historical and sociological research, but also conducted many personal interviews with leaders and theologians, especially those of color. I wrote about the barriers that are preventing congregations to reach and include diverse people. And specifically, I noted the problems of history, the way that Reformed churches have been especially susceptible to promoting an intellectual caste system of sorts that excludes subdominant communities. And also, of course, that history that has been complicit in the perpetuation of white supremacy, the legacy of which endures today. I looked at the problems of theology, the ways that Reformed theology have developed spiritualist theologies that often fail to grapple with socio-political realities. And I looked at the problems of culture, the way that often stated commitments to scripture and doctrine is often confused with Western European cultural practices, which again causes churches and leaders to be resistant to cultural change. So then in chapter 2, I moved on to suggest a methodology for constructing a new, fresh ecclesiology. This is probably the most boring chapter, but it's important because it shows how I'm going to about constructing this new ecclesiology. The basic gist is this, that whereas traditional ecclesiology has done lots of deep thinking about the nature of the church, it has ironically not been very engaged with the actual church. And what I came to believe is that we can't just theologize about the church in an ivory tower. We actually have to get into the trenches to see actual congregations as important sources of theological content. So my methodological approach, I suggested, should begin in real churches, what I called informal theologies or theologies from below. I suggested doing ethnographic research in congregations that are trying to do mission in multicultural environments. And then I suggested to bring that into conversation with formal theologies or theologies from above, Reformed thinkers who I thought could bring an important contribution to this conversation. And I wanted to bring these two voices into conversant with one another. So theory-laden practices interacting with practice-redolent theories, which I hoped would construct a fresh ecclesiology. So in chapter 3, I presented the lived theologies of diverse congregations. I spent a couple of years visiting 3 churches and doing lots of ethnographic research and interviews, trying to understand these communities through qualitative research. I looked at 3 congregations, New City Fellowship in Chattanooga, Spirit and Truth Fellowship in Philadelphia, and Church of All Nations in Minneapolis. I chose these churches because each of them self-identify as theologically reformed and value their tradition, and yet are also critically engaged with it as they seek to reach and reflect diverse environments. I wanted to see what theological adaptations occur in the process of their missional practice. Chapter 4, I attempted to deepen the conversation by looking at some formal theologies of the church. I chose to focus on the work of 3 20th century theologians, Leslie Newbigin, Alan Bosack, and Colin Gunton. I chose these 3 because they are all self-identifying Reformed theologians, each addressed ecclesiology explicitly, and yet they were interested in doing their projects in the light of the church's mission in a post-Christendom context. Each of them in their own way sought to appropriate their own Reformed heritage while critiquing it to help the church engage in mission in a secularizing, diversifying context. So the final chapter is in which I attempt to bring the whole conversation together. I sought to construct a set of theological themes that can help contribute to a missionary ecclesiology that is recognizably Reformed, but also hopefully widely applicable for the broader church. I suggested that such an ecclesiology could first be covenantal, that rather than emphasizing the church as an event or institution, a covenantal ecclesiology emphasizes relationality, mutuality, and equity, embodying a unity that does not suppress, but rather magnifies difference as a gift from God to one another. I also suggested such an ecclesiology should be transformationist, borrowing from a neo-Kuyperian stream of Reformed theology, emphasizing the comprehensive reign of God over all creation, calling the church to be a sign and instrument of renewal for its surrounding society, especially in the way that it addresses systemic sin and structural brokenness. Third, I suggested that it could be an anticipatory ecclesiology, that rather than looking back to see how it can conform to tradition, it will tend to look ahead to the kingdom of God, seeking to anticipate and embody the coming multinational reign of the kingdom. And then finally, I suggested it should be a generous ecclesiology, that rather than holding fast to its own cultural heritage, a missionary ecclesiology will be generous, first in the way that it repents of its own tradition's failures, Second, it will be receptive to the gifts of other traditions and cultures. And finally, it will be engaged in a process of rediscovery as it reinterprets its own tradition freshly in the light of its mission. What will it take for the heterogeneous Western Church to recover and renew its missionary calling in context of multiculturalism? I sought to construct a missionary ecclesiology that helps to answer that question, and my hope here is not just to present a new normative ecclesiology, but more so to offer a process of theological appropriation that can be practiced by other traditions. This title, Reformed and Ever Reforming, comes from the famous Latin call of the Reformed tradition, Semper Reformanda, ever being reformed. Historically, that has meant being ever reformed by the word of God, which I certainly affirm. But I would also suggest that a church that takes its mission seriously will also be ever reformed by its own missionary calling. As a church seeks to be faithful to its missionary vocation in multicultural environments, it will confront and challenge the limitations of its own tradition. It will receive the gifts of new people and practices into its common life, thus experiencing renewal through the work of mission. The possibility is here, I hope, that a church might not just perpetuate its own cultural institutional forms, but it will more and more embody the multinational, multi-ethnic reign of God that we know is coming in fullness. Thank you very much.
May I hear from the candidate that he is prepared to defend his thesis?
Rector, on your authority and as authorized by the College of Deans and in accordance with the Doctoral Examination Committee and the Faculty of Religion and Theology, I am prepared to defend my thesis entitled Reformed and Ever Reforming in order to obtain the degree of Doctor of Philosophy.
Thank you. And then before inviting the colleagues to the defense to raise their questions, I have to remind you that we have 10 minutes for questions and answers. I would like to invite colleague George Hansberger, professor of missiology, Western Theological Seminary, Holland, MI. Thank you, Professor Hansberger, for being with us today and for having to rise up so early to be here with us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for the invitation to be a part of this committee. And I thank you, Corey, for the presentation you have made now, which sounds like what I read. And that's a very effective summary of it. I would like to probe something that begins to rise in your use of language, I think in the second chapter, though I think it sort of bears on your perspectives of the first chapter too. And that is you pick up from Healy, his critique of what he calls blueprint ecclesiology, that which is fashioned somewhere in the air as an idealized portrait of the church that it ought to aspire to be. And so it's an application of what has been given. In other words, deductive theology of the church. I like the analysis of that. And then I also like that you shift when you get to the latter part of the dissertation to bring in formal theologies, Newbigin, Bosak, and Gunton, which you see to have resonance with the fruit of your ethnographic study, which you chose to be your first stage of methodology. But how exactly are these three not blueprint ecclesiologies? After all, they articulate generalized understandings of what the church is, and they give serious advice about how the church should therefore live. Can you clarify what you see to be the difference of these three conversation partners from the blueprint ecclesiologies, which you think should not be our way forward? And how do you distinguish them? By what exactly sets them apart from blueprint ecclesiology?
Learned opponent, thank you for your care and question. I would say a couple of things about that. First of all, I would say, to a certain extent, if we're doing academic theology, if we're systematizing about the church, there is no avoidance to a certain extent of having some degree of deductive forms of theology. We're reading scripture, we're drawing from our tradition, we're coming up with models of the church. So to a certain extent, yes, I think that whether it's New Begin's understanding of the church as sign, foretaste, an instrument, whether it's Gunton's understanding of the church as the echo of the triune life, these in some ways are blueprints in which they're trying to systematize an understanding of the church. A couple of things I would say to your question. First of all, part of the reason why I chose these three theologians is because they were actively practitioners in the life and mission of the church. That is certainly the case with New Begin and Bosack. It is lesser to an extent with Gunton, although Gunton was actively involved in the same tiny Anglican parish for 25 years and preached regularly and was part of the leadership there. And so I was drawn to the fact that these were men who were actually seeking to be a part of the mission of the Church of God in their local community. And so it wasn't just them struggling in a place of a siloed isolation from the life and practice of the church, but they were actually engaged in it. I guess the other thing I would say, Dr. Hunsberger, is that I think my point in drawing from Healy is not so much that we shouldn't deal with blueprint theologies or have any part to play in deductive forms of ecclesiology, but that those deductive forms should always be in conversation with ground root, grass up, inductive forms of ecclesiology that are born out of the generative life of actual lived congregations. So it's more that I was proposing there needs to be a conversation. It wasn't an either or, no blueprint theologies, only grassroots, inductive, organic ecclesiologies, but they really need to be in conversation with each other so that they can inform and be in a dialectic relationship with one another.
Let me follow up with a brief follow-up to that. Some of the critique of blueprint ecclesiologies can especially be felt to have bearing upon how we think centuries-old ecclesiologies espoused now feel like that harsh blueprint, top-down kind of thing. But I wonder if historically it takes more care to look at a 16th or 17th century ecclesiology, for example, and recognize it is something that has companionship in its own environment with the living church. And so that it's a matter of context that makes a big difference. I do see that when you talk about choosing these three, you say, did theological work in express conversation with the declining dominance of European culture and Christendom in the West, the growing reality of secularism, the influx of cultural plurality, and the racial and cultural tensions at play in Western culture. I think for many periods of church history, there may be more of that same context than we would think, and there may be lesser of an angst of those kinds of circumstances. Does that help to?
Yes.
That part of how you're distinguishing the voices you're hearing because they're speaking to our world at our time?
Right. So what I hear you saying is that, maybe it's not entirely fair for us to judge, say, a 16th century conception of the church as a strict blueprint theology, because in many ways, they were actually doing the very thing that New Begin, Gunton, and Bosack were trying to do. They were trying to actually work out an understanding of the church in the practice of mission. So Calvin, for example, we know was a practitioner himself. He was actually creating his understanding of the church in the context of Geneva, trying to work out how the church was actually being and doing the work of the church. So I totally get that. I think that maybe what that does is it behooves us, when we attend to these blueprint theologies, to be much more attentive to the context in which the church was actually seeking to carry out their vocation within the time and place they were called. So maybe we shouldn't be so quick to judge ecclesiologies of the past as blueprint theologies, but see that they were perhaps doing that work themselves that we're attempting to do today.
I have a follow-up if there is yet time.
I would like to proceed maybe with the procedure so that if we
That's good.
have time for the second round, you
That's
are more
great.
than welcome to
Yes.
pose the second.
Thank you.
I invite colleague Arnold Huygen, Professor of Systematic Theology at the Theological University of Apeldoorn. Thank you, Professor Huygen, for being with us today. Please raise your question.
Thank you, Rector. On the authority of the Rector and by virtue of my right, I would like to congratulate the candidate with the completion of his dissertation. You take the adage semper reformanda seriously, and you aim at a reformed ecclesiology in missionary, multicultural context. And you have served the academic community and the Reformed community worldwide very well with your research. So congratulations. Of course, I have a number of questions, and having heard the discussion you already had, I choose to ask another question than I intended to. You have selected Colin Gunton as one of your discussion partners. And if I ask you why, you will probably say, well, because he's Reformed and because he's a social Trinitarian. So that makes the interesting connection. But wouldn't it have been better to have selected another social Trinitarian rather than Colin Gunton in this respect? Because ecclesiology is not really the focal point of Gunton's theological system. And as you write on page 148, and I quote, Gunton flatly dismisses the ecclesiological work of the reformers who, believing that the reformation of doctrine was all that was needed, failed to develop a theology of the community. Well, as you just said, Calvin is an important example of someone who developed a theology of the community too. Wouldn't it have been better, given the fact that Gunton, as a Reformed theologian, dismisses Reformed ecclesiology like he does, to have selected another social Trinitarian, say, for instance, Miroslav Volf, for whom ecclesiology is more center stage in his theology?
Learned opponent, thank you so much for that excellent question. Maybe you are right. I admit I was always very clear from the beginning that I wanted to work with Newbegin and Bosak. I was less clear about Gunton. I was always drawn to Gunton because I had done work previously in a previous master's program, and I really was personally attracted to his understanding of perichoresis. But I also knew he was problematic for various reasons, not the least of which is all of the criticism that his own form of social Trinitarianism has come under, even since his death. So I did actually consider Volf. I actually really wanted to use Volf. I love Miroslav Volf. I love the paper, The Trinity is Our Social Program, and how often he talks about the church. He's a deeply engaged public theologian who is engaged in the life of the world. He loves the church. He has passion for the church. The reason why, in talking with my supervisors, I didn't go with Volf is because he's not self-identifying as Reformed. He's from a Pentecostal background, and I really wanted to look at a theologian who was critically engaged with the Reformed tradition, because I wanted to look at the ways that these Reformed theologians were engaging with their own tradition in a way that was adaptive and experimental.
But just to follow up on that, do you need to be Reformed to critically engage the Reformed tradition? If you're Reformed in the way Colin Gunton is Reformed in his ecclesiology, being very negative about the Reformers because of his criticism of Augustine, of course, well, what use is it that he's formally Reformed in this respect if his ecclesiology is not going to help you to rebuild Reformed ecclesiology?
Right, you're saying Gunton isn't really Reformed anyway, so who cares? I mean,
well, at least not in his ecclesiology. In
yes,
this
that's
respect.
true. Although he does engage with the doctrine of election explicitly, and adapt that doctrine in much of the way that Newbigin does to be more about corporate responsibility and missional calling than individual assurance. So he does do some engagement explicitly with Reformed doctrines and apply them ecclesiologically. I guess I would say you're probably right. I think if I had to do it over again, I probably wouldn't use Gunton. I think that even though I love Gunton, I think there's too many problems around his social Trinitarianism. Even just some of the critiques, the way that he collapses the notion of ousia into hypostasis, and really doesn't even really see any room at all for the substance of God. He's in some ways collapses that Cappadocian tension into the communion, the relationality of God, and the fact that I think it was Dr. Mao actually who might have said, "Is this really the best way to inspire people to think about multi-ethnicity in the church?" There's not many people, at least for me as a pastor in the pulpit, I'm really probably not going to be talking about the hypostatic perichoretic union of the triune God as a way to inspire people into multi-ethnicity in the church. It's not exactly a populist way to inspire the people. And so even though I'm moved by it, probably not the best tool. So yeah, Wolf is probably a better interlocutor if I were to rewrite it.
Yeah. Is there time to follow up, Rector? I really like your dog, by the way.
Thank you. I didn't give him any invitation yet to speak. If I may, I'd like to proceed with the procedure and hoping that we will have enough time for the second round of questions. It is now my turn to articulate the question of our colleague, Kristen Dide Johnson, Professor of Theology and Christian Formation at Western Theological Seminary, Holland, MI. Professor Johnson couldn't be present today, so I will ask the question myself. This gives me also an opportunity to introduce myself to you today. I'm Katya Tolstoy, Professor of Theology and Religion in the Post-Trauma Societies and Vice Dean and Dean of Research at our faculty. Professor Johnson asks, and I'm reading her question, in the history section of your first chapter, you make some interesting points about the academic nature of the Reformed tradition. You write, for example, that, quote, according to many interviewees, the root of the inability of the Reformation churches to reach non-European populations can be traced back as far as the Reformation itself. The 17th century Reformation was, broadly speaking, a movement of academic scholars, unquote. I'd like to ask you how you would put this legacy of the Reformation in conversation with scholarship that notes the significance of the context of Calvin's Geneva for his thought. In other words, Calvin was not just writing academic treatise, he was structuring a city with attention to social and economic needs and realities while working out his theological convictions. One forthcoming piece on this topic, for example, notes that, quote, immigration was a defining characteristic of the early Reformation. Whether fleeing political persecution, seeking religious freedom, sending missionaries, or welcoming refugees into their midst, the 16th century reformers were a people on the move. They were constantly interacting with different languages and cultures, crossing borders, planting churches in new soil, and wrestling with biblical demands to provide justice and hospitality for foreigners, unquote. The author continues, quote, Calvin's Geneva offers a fascinating case study of a community of faith struggling to make space for newcomers, all the while resisting the temptations of xenophobia and nativist protectionism. As a community, Geneva was intimately aware of both ends of the immigrant experience, unquote. So the question comes, how might this aspect of the Reformed heritage contribute to your larger project of constructing a missionary ecclesiology for congregations in multicultural contexts that is acceptably Reformed?
Learned opponent, thank you for that really important question. I don't know, I think that Professor Johnson may have been quoting actually from an article that I have read. I think Josh Ralston wrote that about Calvin's Geneva, and that it was a place of refuge and hospitality for the refugee community, and how much of Calvin's ecclesiological thinking was formed around that reality. You know, I didn't engage with that from a historical standpoint. I'm not a historian. I was more looking at the ongoing impact of not so much Calvin, but Calvin's followers and the Reformation tradition that took from Calvin's legacy. And in the words of one of the interviewees that I interviewed, that the priest of the altar was replaced by the scholar in the pulpit. And so that was really the tradition that I was looking at, was that how the legacy of that Reformation was not so much continued to promote a form of sacerdotalism in the way that leaders, especially the leadership of the church, became especially difficult for people from subdominant cultures to access, because it required such a high degree of training and education, and sometimes displacement to universities, and increasingly, especially in the our current contemporary space, that becomes an exclusionary practice to people of color and to subdominant communities who don't have the privileges to be able to do that kind of training. That being said, I actually think that what Professor Johnson raises is a great idea, and I think that it would actually be really, really fruitful to look at the way that Calvin's practices in Geneva itself, and some of the ways that the Reformation was a movement of engaging with immigrants and refugee communities and church planting and adapting to new missionary situations, could actually speak very relevantly to our contemporary situation. I just admit I didn't bring that into the purview of the study, and don't feel like I have the kind of training as a historian to be able to do that work. So I hope that's adequate in my answer to that question.
Thank you. And you have probably the life ahead of you as an academicus in the future to be able to pick up nice ideas from the opponents.
Yes, I agree.
I would like now to invite our colleague, Carl Ellis, the Provost Professor of Theology and Culture and Senior Fellow of the African American Leadership Initiative, Reformed Theological Seminary. Thank you, Professor Ellis, for your contribution to this PhD defense. Please unmute.
Okay, all right. I was trying to save some bandwidth there. I'm very honored to be here. It was indeed a pleasure to read this, and I just thought, I'm in the struggle myself, trying to be reformed in a way that is that touches people where they are. I do have, and I think I've shared this with you before, Corey. I do have some concerns. I think I know your heart. I know where you're coming from. But in statements like, let's say, you talk about, you quote Manny Ortiz and his theological hospitality, making space for new and alternative voices, theologies, and traditions. Okay, amen to all of that. But I think, I guess I would ask you, in light of today's cultural confusion, I see us, I've often said this, that we are living in a time of what I call the second Babel. First Babel was confusion of languages in terms of the words used and phrases used. But today we have a confusion of language, and it's not so much words, and we all use the same words, but we have radically different meanings. You know, like social justice. I mean, if you look at a classical understanding of social justice, it means justice applied in a social context. You know, that's it. But in today's world of critical theory and all the rest of that, social justice has come to mean something entirely different, even opposite of what social justice is. And I call this the DPRK syndrome, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It's not democratic, it's not other people, it's not a republic. Okay, so when we talk about other theologies, and we, you know, we have seen this happen, and people put things out there about theology. They claim to be theologians, but actually what it is, it's ideology disguised as theology. Okay, so my question then is, how then, if we're going to do this thing, this covenantal ecclesiology, how are we going to guard ourselves or make clear of, you know, what we really mean, as opposed to what people think we mean? Does that make sense? It's like,
Yes.
Yeah, we can say, you know, there are other people saying this very same thing. It sounds like they're saying the same thing, but they mean something entirely different. So that's my
Learned opponent, thank you for your question. It's great to have you with us, Carl.
It's great to be here.
I think this is why I really landed on this understanding of any constructive ecclesiology has to be apostolic, not just adaptive, not just contextual, not just relevant, but apostolic. I think that as far as I can tell, is the best way to ground all of our theological adaptations and experimentation and generativity and hospitality in something that is translocal, something that is beyond simply our sociality and our ways of adapting and contextualizing. This was a little bit of my concern, you know, when my chapter 2, when I looked at Browning and Roger Haidt and Healy, I really liked Browning and Haidt, but especially Browning, I was concerned that he was so privileging ethnographic descriptions of the church over theological ones that there wasn't actually any sort of translocal grounding to the church itself. And even Haidt, it was really just about how can the church just adapt to whatever new context it's in. But there was, again, nothing that was above and beyond the church that was grounding it. And so the reason I liked Healy so much and Flett is because both of them are saying there is, when we use an apostolic understanding of the ecclesiological frame for the church, there is something translocal. There's something that we are bearing witness to, and that is the event of God's revelation in Jesus Christ. That is the translocal, grounding, authoritative event that Scripture bears witness to. It's not just about adapting and discarding and reclaiming whatever we want to be relevant, but there's something that we are bearing witness to that grounds the witness of the church. And yet it's apostolic in the sense that it always is having to adapt. I think the theater metaphor is really good. Haidt uses that. Healy uses that. Newbegin sort of gestures towards it. Kevin Van Hooser, you know, I didn't use Kevin Van Hooser, but he's fantastic about this in his book, The Drama of Doctrine. And Van Hooser explicitly says that the gospel is, I think he uses, Scripture is the authoritative script. It's the authoritative script that the church takes, and then the church becomes the theater of improvisation, where it begins to work out. So the church is improvising, the church is contextualizing, the church is responding to its context, but there is some sort of script that is grounding its improvisation. So that's why I think the apostolic and theatrical metaphors are really so good.
Just one other minor point. We talked about this blueprint theology. I've observed that blueprint theology was not blueprint theology at the time of its formulation. They were then trying to they were, and so the blueprintness of the theology is something that we have ascribed to it, rather than it being, you know, in its formulation.
Very good point. Yeah. It never attempts to start as a blueprint Well,
Right.
I'd say maybe with some theologians it does, but but
Right.
but it's more us later who make it so, as we
We become
lose the
theologically
context.
lazy. We become
Yeah.
theologically lazy in subsequent generations. We don't do our own theology. Yeah.
Right. Right.
At that point, I would like to invite colleague Richard Mao, Professor of Faith and Public Life and President Emeritus of Fuller Theological Seminary, Senior Research Fellow at the Henry Institute for the Study of Religion and Politics at Calvin University, Grand Rapids, MI. Thank you, Professor Mao, for your contribution to this PhD defense and for being with us today and for raising up so early in the morning. It's our honor.
Thank you, Rector. And on the authority of the Rector and by virtue of my right, Corey, I want to congratulate you on this great occasion. I thank you for a very stimulating and I believe very creative dissertation. And my question that I want to ask now is really a follow-up to some of the things in Carl Ellis's question to you. And it has to do with the ways in which people throw certain theological terms around. And as you have described these three congregations, their Reformed identity, you hear coming through with really two themes that loom large. One is sovereignty, divine sovereignty, and the other is a covenantal character. I seldom get suspicious of people who talk about divine sovereignty. When somebody talks about sovereign grace, I'm already assured of their theology. And I want to say too that we celebrate the sovereign grace of the God who has brought you to this place today. He does indeed work in academic careers and in research, and I'm profoundly grateful for the ways in which that grace is on display in your work here. The word covenant and covenantal, though, I hear it a lot in liberal denominations and very broad theological circles. It's kind of a catchword in many ways today. And so my question really focuses on that part, although if I get a chance for another question later, I do want to talk about divine sovereignty as well. But in describing the communal patterns of these churches, we learn a lot from you about ecclesial practices. I'm sorry, we don't learn a lot from you about ecclesial practices that have long been considered vital to Reformed ecclesiology. In the spirit of and truth fellowship, for example, and like you, I'm a great fan of many of the late and of blessed memory, Manny Ortiz. What, if any, in a church like that, a Reformed, Dutch Reformed background church, is the role of the Heidelberg Catechism in preparing persons for congregational membership in the Presbyterian settings? What are the requirements for ordination to the office of ruling elder? How does the covenantal character of the community relationships in those congregations relate to traditional understandings of the doctrine of the covenant? That God, in baptizing children, for example, signs and seals the promises of his covenant to them. I mean, that's been there from certainly from the days of the Heidelberg Catechism. Are these concerns associated with the past forms that have to be downplayed in a congregation as the congregation moves forward into a stronger missional identity? Or are they being preserved? And what do we have to do to make sure that they keep being preserved, even when we're enthusiastic about the missional character of their congregational self-understanding?
Learned opponent, thank you for your question. And I am very grateful, Dr. Mao, that you're up so early in the morning. Thank you. That's a great question. And I read some of the feedback, and now I know that you were the one who provided some of that feedback about the way that they are catechized, and I having read that, I immediately thought, oh gosh, I wish I would have asked some of those questions about how they did confirmation, about how they did ordination, about how they use the catechisms, how they use the confessions. I will say, so I think that was an omission on my part. I should have looked at ways that they were using some of the confessions and creeds of the Reformed tradition. I think I'll just say from my own experience in those churches, it a little bit depended on how confessional the church was and how rooted it was within the classic Reformed tradition. So, for example, New City Fellowship, which is PCA, deeply valued its commitment, and I think Carl may even be a part of New City Fellowship. Is that right, Carl? Deeply values this Reformed tradition, uses the creeds and confessions. The pastor there is, every week, when you hear him preaching, every week he's quoting from the Westminster Catechism or he's quoting from the Westminster Confession. He's really doing the work. He's very self-consciously Reformed, drawing from the deep roots of his confessional Reformed identity, and then also seeking to weave it into the Black preaching tradition and the Black experience. It's pretty an amazing thing to watch. Same with Manny Ortiz, the late Manny Ortiz. They were very similarly treasured and valued their Reformed tradition, but were really seeking to adapt it and supplement it. And in the midst of that, it wasn't that they were discarding the traditional understanding of the covenant. It was more that they were supplementing it. That the themes of covenant that related to relationality and their responsibility to the community tended to be more present in the everyday conversation in the church than it was talking about, say, infant baptism or the common the way that the Old and New Testaments are tied together through the covenant. I'd say the one difference of that, the different was the third church, Church of All Nations, much more progressive congregation, and much more self-consciously critical of the Reformed faith and of their Reformed heritage. So much so that it was actually written into their purpose statement. I think they called themselves apologetically Presbyterian. Not apologetically as in trying to defend it, but and I must admit, I didn't do this as a researcher because I was just trying to have a position of objectivity, but I must admit, of the three, I was most concerned of the three that they were the most discarding of their tradition and really seeking to take the words like covenant, like sovereignty, and empty those words of historic meaning and put new meaning inside of it, of what it meant. And so I think it in some ways depends on the congregation and how rooted it is in its tradition and how rooted it is in and how much requirement there is within the denomination itself for them to be rooted within those historic confessions and doctrines. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. And that's a very important set of distinctions you've made, and I really appreciate the candor and the clarification that you just provided, because some of us with our Reformed antennae buzzing as we read through that will need that kind of clarification. Yeah, thanks.
Well, and I think the doctrine of election is a great example of that. That especially within the more conservative churches like New City and Spirit and Truth, it was not that they were discarding the idea of predestination as a doctrine of individual assurance. It was that they also tended to draw from, even unknowingly, kind of new beginnian concepts of election as being that there's a purpose to it. We're not just called to sit around and enjoy our saved status. They had a very, very strong sense of their call to be agents of mission to their surrounding community. And so they were not discarding, but filling the bucket of election with new, fresh content.
Yeah. And that's where I think, along with my colleague from Apeldoorn, that we might have wished that you'd been a little tougher on Gunton, who
Yeah.
says that he wants a election as a faithfulness to God's mission rather than a doctrine
yeah.
of individual assurance. Those of us who love the canons of Dort who
Right.
tell us that it's very important to know, have the assurance of your election, even though with varying degrees and at different processes. That's one of the areas where I just wish you would have simply disagreed with Gunton.
Yes, I'm hearing that dear Professor Gunton is not it's not in. I should have done different and better work with Gunton. Yes, I'm hearing that, and I agree.
That's nice. And there is also some room for consideration, as there is also room in our defense to go with the second round of the questions. And I would like to invite Professor Hansberger to raise his second question, follow-up question. Please unmute.
Thank you, and I will correct my omission before and say, on the authority of the rector and by virtue of my rights, I congratulate you, Corey, on the completion of this dissertation, which I find to be very fine. And I congratulate you for this moment. Let me ask, it's a touchy question even as I think about it. Your thesis makes a forceful case overall. It's not the case you're making as much as you presume and imply the case that churches, thinking of congregations and or denominations, should be multicultural in the ways the society in general has become. You utilize the currently standard sociological metric of a multicultural church as one in which no single culture comprises more than 80% of the membership, which I take to be a very low bar, frankly. But I know that sociologists measuring things that way so they can count them. But you urge churches and denominations, congregations and denominations to move in that direction. I feel the brunt of that as a part of a mostly white, but with scattered others among us in a congregation in Holland, Michigan. Holland is a town in which, as you can guess, it had its beginnings among the Dutch, and now we are 23% Hispanic, mostly Mexican, but other Central American, Caribbean locations. So there we have a context. There are some Asians, there are some African Americans, not in great numbers, but increasingly they're a part of the mix. So I can feel that, in fact, our congregation, where I'm a part, it is looking at that and trying to broaden our relationships in light of that and find the best way forward. So your dissertation would help. And I would imagine if you came as a guest, you would help us understand we ought to look like the mix of the community. Would you say the same thing to the Hispanic Pentecostal church 3 blocks away? Would you say the same thing to an African American church in Grand Rapids? That is where the majority population is much more than 80%.
Right.
Would you say they also should represent the whole context? They should be seeking to expand themselves to incorporate others,
Right.
whether Asian, European.
Right. Learned opponent, thank you. That's an excellent question, and one that I've actually grappled a lot with, just on a personal level as a practitioner and a pastor in the church. First of all, you're right. I almost took as for granted that part of the calling of the church is to help embody, reflect, and actually represent the diversity of the people in its local community. I didn't do foundational hermeneutical and interpretive work, scripture, to defend that. If I were preaching on this, if I were teaching a class, I would have done that. To do that would have drawn in a whole nother interdisciplinary field of biblical interpretation and hermeneutics, and I was already overly complicating with too many disciplines already. So that being said, I think that it's a tricky question because first of all, the history of the oppression of non-white peoples in the United States has required often for subdominant communities to have their own homogenous communities as places of rest and safety and refuge amidst a majority white culture. I mean, for the Black church for so many years, the Black church was a necessary place of homogeneity because it provided the kind of support and care and rejuvenation that the Black church needed as it sought to live out its vocation in a society marked by white supremacy. Even today, there are many times when, especially immigrant churches who are new to the United States or refugees may need to be in monocultural communities in order to provide stability and support for these new families who need shared culture in order to do that. I guess I would say is that the long arc, I think, of what God ultimately longs for us is to gesture and lean towards, if not complete representation, at least solidarity with those in our community. It requires us to open our eyes and see the diversity of cultures that God in his sovereignty has brought into our sphere. And that this kind of missional ecclesiology requires us to not so much seek to become, not in every case seek to become a multi-ethnic church, because in some cases that may not be the best thing, but to at least become people who are living in solidarity with those around us. And in many cases to actually seek to represent the fullness of diversity of those around us. But I would say that is also a sensitive pastoral issue, depending on the nature of the church, whether or not it's a majority culture church or minority culture church. And that it would be wrong to just simply say, like, every church should be multi-ethnic. I used to think that. I don't think that anymore. I think solidarity is a better word than demanding multi-ethnicity in every congregation.
Yeah. In our white thinking, solidarity can mean a lot of very inert things that don't really have much grip, but I take what you're saying to mean more than that. However, I wonder if the very way that I put the question belies what you draw from Newbegin, a lack of a sense of the church is the people, is all in each place. Let's put it that way.
The sign and the foretaste of the redeemed humanity.
It's more a matter of, we don't need to say our particular self-standing, self-sufficient church needs to accommodate this issue. It is us together in a place. So the ecumenical impulse, it seems to me, is for me at least a way to say that this leads to how we can think better about this question.
Right, and even in that impulse, seeking to, if we as a single congregation cannot embody the full cultural diversity of God's people in a single place, which is probably not realistic, we can at least lean towards and work in solidarity with those of diverse communities that are around us. And even that requires the same sort of cycle of challenge, adaptation, receptivity, receiving the gifts of new communities. Even that kind of ecumenicity, I think, still would require this kind of challenge and constructive ecclesiology that I've proposed here, even if it's not happening in a single congregation.
We still have some time, and I would like to ask Professor Huigen to proceed with his questions.
Thank you, Rector. On the authority of the Rector and by virtue of my right, since the candidate moved along with my previous question, I would like to ask something else now. You agree with Tim Keller that cultural diversity is crucial for the church, and this follows up on the previous question by colleague Hansberger. Why would cultural diversity of a local church be better per se than a very specific culture? Have you considered whether Abraham Kuyper's idea of a plurality of churches can help in a true way? And wouldn't that fit more in a Reformed ecclesiology than, for instance, the practice of the Church of All Nations to incorporate Native American spirituality into its worship? I really look forward to your answer.
Learned opponent, thank you. I'm just glad you didn't ask me about Colin Gunton again. Yeah, I actually did consider Kuyper's doctrine of the pluriformity of the church. Unfortunately, that doctrine has often been used, as you probably know, in South Africa to actually justify segregation and apartheid and oppression. Obviously that was a distortion of what Kuyper intended. Now that my defense has ended, I sincerely thank the opponents for the attention they have devoted to my thesis. I now look forward to the decision of the Doctoral Examination Committee and the Faculty School of Religion and Theology, which will decide whether the degree of Doctor of Philosophy will be granted to me.
I hereby adjourn the public meeting of the Doctoral Examination Commission of the Faculty of Religion and Theology for further deliberations. I continue this PhD ceremony. By its duly accorded authority, the Doctoral Examination Committee of the Faculty of Religion and Theology grants the degree of Doctor of Philosophy to Corey Jackson Widmer. I testify in public that the candidate has signed the PhD register, promising to preserve at all times the norms of scientific integrity as laid down in the Netherlands Code of Conduct for Scientific Practice. Professor Eddie van den Borgt, appointed by the College of Deans as supervisor, will perform the investiture. The certificate will be sent to you later, and it will be signed by the supervisor. Professor Eddie van den Borgt is professor of systematic theology at our faculty, and the other supervisor is Professor Stefan Paas, professor of missiology and intercultural theology at our faculty, and professor of missiology at Theological University of Kampen. I now request colleague Professor Stefan Paas to continue this ceremony.
I believe Eddie van den Borgt is first for the investiture.
Yes, I will do the investiture.
Yes, and I will do the laudatio afterwards.
Very well.
By the virtue of the authority vested in me by the statute of the Vrije Universiteit, and as supervisor appointed thereto by the College of Deans, I hereby confirm on you, Corey Jackson Widmer, the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, together with all rights, privileges, and responsibilities thereto appertaining. In witness thereof, the seal of the university and signatures of the rector and the supervisors have been affixed to the diploma you are about to receive.
And now I request colleague Professor Stefan Paas to continue the ceremony.
Thank you, dear Rector. Dear Corey, dear Dr. Widmer, it may have been 10 years ago, give or take, that Daryl Gooder mentioned your name to me for the first time. Back then, I was a beginning professor of missiology, and Daryl was kind enough to mentor me. And what better way to support a rather uncertain initiate into the field of academic missiology than by suggesting to supervise a very good PhD student. That's where he mentioned your name as one of his best and brightest. Since then, I've always tried to emanate my non-existent confidence and experience to you. And by now I can tell that I have learned as much from you as you may have learned from me. Be that as it may, you are likely to be one of the easiest PhD students I'll ever have, and I'm quite sure that Eddie would say the same. Normally, PhD students submit a draft chapter once in every 3 or 4 months or so. Then the supervisors review it, send it back, and the candidate starts rewriting it until we reach the point where everybody is more or less satisfied. Not so with you, Corey. Every year, you kept silent for 10 months or so. And at the very point where Eddie and I started wondering if you still existed, with the regularity of an atomic clock, you submitted a complete chapter, worked out in every detail, almost ready for publication. Basically, Eddie and I only had to give our approval and some suggestions for the next chapter before you submerged again as a human submarine diving through oceans of books, only to surface a year later with another chapter. There was only one hiccup in the rhythm a couple of years ago when you suggested to terminate the project. You, the easiest of all candidates, asked us if the project didn't take too long and if we still had confidence in you. It seems that you felt that your PhD had become too much of a burden for your family and perhaps for yourself, given your very demanding pastoral responsibilities in Richmond. And I'm so glad that we could encourage you to persist. Moreover, I want to thank your wife, Sarah, and your 4 daughters, Sophie, Anna, Phoebe, and Franny, for supporting you in all these years. Every dissertation is a work of sacrifice, and much of this sacrifice is given by those who love you enough to make this possible. It is such a great blessing to be surrounded by persons who love you. Meanwhile, I wonder if this was just a normal bout of insecurity that almost every PhD candidate has at some point, or if it tells us a bit more about you and your theological drive. One of your most formative experiences in your life has been your time as a personal assistant to John Stott, the famous evangelical statesman. Some weeks ago, you wrote a great article at the event of Stott's 100th birthday. It was titled, "Commemorating the Uncommon Humility of John Stott." In this article, you take American evangelicals to task for their preoccupation with success and personality-based ministry, their tribalism and intellectual shallowness, their pursuit of political and cultural power, and their cultural superiority. Uncle John's cultural humility is the example you hold before your fellow pastors and believers in America. And I'd say this cultural humility has found its way into your dissertation, but it's also rooted in personal humility. You're obviously a very bright intellect, Corey, a great thinker and writer. But this time, some years back, when you shared your uncertainty about the project and your considerations for your family, may characterize you even more. I've learned to know you as a kind person and a great guest. Corey Whitmer, said my wife yesterday. Was he the guy who brought flowers? Such a nice person. Please give him my warm regards. My wife is a great judge of people, by the way. Humility and kindness are not opposed to prophetic criticism. That is what John Stott modeled to you, and is what I find in your research. There's something prophetic to a dissertation that works out a theology for multicultural congregations in what has been a dominant white and Western tradition until very recently. It is quite clear that it also connects with your ministry in Richmond, Virginia. With Eddie and me, you shared some of your pastoral experiences during the pre-election turmoil in an ethnically polarized city. In the common statement from Richmond pastors and ministry leaders that I found on your Twitter account, it says, Richmond, Virginia has long been a significant location in the dark history of racism and violence in America. It is a strong statement for human dignity, equality, and justice. The statement, also signed by you, concludes with the following words: "We resolve to lead in the way of love and to seek ways to heal the divisions that separate races and cultures in our city. We resolve to listen to those who have been wounded and dehumanized by racism. We resolve to pray fervently for God's healing and reconciliation. And we resolve to help our churches become more hospitable and welcoming communities to diverse people." In other words, your dissertation has not just been an academic project, it has been a work of faith and ministry towards the kingdom of peace, ruled by the Prince of Peace. And I'm very grateful that the work is now completed and that Eddie and I could be part of your journey in all these years. And I pray that the book will be a great inspiration for many believers in a world that cries for peace. Thank you, Corey.
Yes, amen.
Thank you so much.
To the congratulations of the supervisors, I gladly add the congratulations of the Council of Deans of this university. This doctoral examination ceremony is now completed. By pronouncing the doxology, I would like to close this public session of the Doctoral Examination Committee of the Faculty of Religion and Theology. The name of the Lord be praised to all eternity.